Okay, so we're going to be studying Pareshat Vayechi. It is the parsha where Yaakov Avinu spends his last 17 years in Egypt, in an environment that's far calmer than the journey of his life that we've studied over the past few weeks. It starts off with Yaakov communicating with Yosef that he does not want to be buried in Egypt. The second event that's described is the blessings of Yaakov to his grandchildren and upgrading the status of Menashe and Ephraim. And then we have what the Torah calls the blessings that Yaakov gives his children. When you read those blessings, you notice that Yaakov actually uses some harsh words towards his children. But we can nevertheless call it a blessing, because what Yaakov was really doing to his children was giving them the tools to understand themselves. If we want to achieve anything in life, one of the most important things is obviously to know who we are and to know our strengths and also to know our weaknesses. And what Yaakov Avinu here is doing is he's telling these children that you should know you have specific strengths and you have weaknesses. Be aware of them, work on the weaknesses, focus on your strengths. And this was a message that was relevant not just to the children themselves, but rather to the descendants of the children. That when our ancestors, if you were from the tribe of Gad or from the tribe of Dan or Asher or Yehuda or Reuven, and you wanted to have an understanding and an appreciation of who you were, you would turn to this text for guidance. Now, we don't have the ability, or many of us don't know from what tribe we are, but nevertheless, we can appreciate the idea that perhaps the greatest blessing is to know who we are and how we can make a contribution. So that's the section of the portion that deals with the brachot. Eventually, the Torah describes the passing of Yaakov and the journey that is made by the children, joined by a significant entourage of significant Egyptians on their way back to Eretz Yisrael, and the Torah describes a few details regarding the procession. Now, the parsha ends off, it is in chapter 50, verse 18. It ends off with a very uncomfortable interaction between Yosef and his brothers. The brothers are concerned. After all, they did some awful things to Yosef. And they decide to communicate with Yosef by making up a story. And the story is, they turn to Yosef and they say, you know, Yosef, our father asked before his passing that you should be forgiving. Yosef knew very well that the father did not ask for such a thing, but it was an opportunity for him to reassure his brothers that he's not holding a grudge. So what we're going to do today is we're going to review this parsha a little bit backwards. In other words, we're going to start off by analyzing topics and texts from the end, and then we're going to move to the front sections of the parsha. So we're going to focus here on Yosef communicating with his brothers, trying to calm them down and make it clear to the brothers, worry not, I will not take revenge. And Vayomer Alehem, so this is in verse 19 of chapter 50. Yosef says to his brothers, Al tirau, fear not, ki atachat Elokim ani. You know, I don't take the role of God. I don't act God. And then he adds the following four words, which we're going to focus on a little bit. Va'atem, you know, brothers, you, chashavtem alai ra'ah. You know, you intended me harm. But reality is, Elokim, God Almighty, chashva letova. In other words, you, when you sold me, right, to these merchants, taking me south towards Egypt, when you sold me to these Midianites or to the Ishmaelim, traveling towards Egypt, your intention, unfortunately, was Ra'ah. But there's a higher being, and he has a plan. Elokim chashva letova. God had good intentions with those events. Lema'an asok hayom hazeh lachayot emrav. Because do you know how many people have been kept alive due to that sale, due to that interaction? Okay? Inspiring words, even if you read them on the most basic level. But there's a fascinating Sforno, Rabbi Ovadia Sforno, early 16th century commentator, and he takes those four words, Va'atem chashaftem alai ra'ah. You had machshava, thoughts, upon me, which were ra'ah, which were bad, which were evil. Comes Rabbi Ovadia Sforno, and he tells us there's another way to read these few words. Atem, Yosef turns to his brothers and says, you, chashaftem alai, you thought upon my actions that they are ra'ah. In other words, let's go back to the beginning of Pareshat Vayechi. Young Yosef is communicating with his father and sharing lots of information, negative information about his brothers, that they are doing some awful things. Vayave Yosef et dibatam ra'a el avihem. In the mind of the brothers, what Yosef is trying to do is to take them and shove them aside, just as they saw that Avraham Avinu had one son that was not the carrier of the tradition, but rather rejected, Ishmael. And just as they saw by their grandfather Yitzchak, that there was one son who was the carrier of tradition and one was rejected, their concern was that Yosef had an agenda. And his agenda was to convince the father that only Yosef should be the one to carry the tradition, and all the other siblings and all the other tribes should be rejected. So therefore, Yosef is turning to his brothers, according to this reading. And he says, I personally have no issue with you, because when you made those decisions to sell me, it was a decision you made based on what you were thinking. And you thought at the time that my intentions, remember, this is Yosef talking, you brothers thought that my intentions with my actions were basically to have you all rejected and cast away. Atem chashaftem alai, you thought upon my actions that they were ra'ah, that they were bad. So therefore, your decision to go ahead and sell me based on how you assess the situation was the right decision. Now, you happen to be wrong, right? But if that would have been the truth, in other words, if indeed Yosef's agenda was to have them all cast away, set aside, not be the carriers of this incredible and magnificent tradition, if that would have been the case, what they did to Yosef was actually justified. So this is Yosef turning to his brothers and saying what you did was not terrible, because your intentions, even though you were mistaken, but your intentions actually had basis, because you were concerned that my intention was ra'ah. Atem chashaftem alai ra'ah. Fine. So this indicates, by the way, an incredible righteousness of Yosef, but it also reminds me of a story. In other words, this ability of Yosef to look at their actions, which were terrible, but claim that since in their mind it was the right thing to do, so therefore what they did was not so terrible. So it reminds me of the following story. As you know, we spent a few years in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and we were part of the Kehillah there of Rabbi Twersky, a Hasidic community. Rabbi Twersky and the Twerskys are very special people. And there was a time when he actually had a series about great Hasidic masters. And sometimes I would go to some of the lectures, sometimes I would hear recordings. And I remember the following story. And obviously, I don't recall all the details, but I can share with you what inspired me and what impressed me. There's a story about the Baal Shem Tov. Now, the Baal Shem Tov, early 18th century, the father of this new movement, had many, many people who had a negative attitude towards what he was doing. And a lot of the legends of Hasidic masters have to do with the fact of how they interacted with those who questioned them. So there's a story that a specific zealot who was against the Hasidic movement was extremely upset for the changes being made by this Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, and decided that he's going to go ahead, come to Mezhibush, to the town of the Baal Shem Tov, if I got it right, and throw some stones at him. In other words, to show his anger that the Baal Shem Tov is doing such terrible things against God Almighty and against Jewish tradition and against Minhagim, he's going to throw some stones at him. So the zealot travels, and he even brought with him stones, the designated one to go ahead and throw at the Baal Shem Tov. And he waits outside of the shtibel, and eventually he identifies the Baal Shem Tov. But as he gets closer and he sees the Baal Shem Tov, he steps aside, and he's in awe of the individual, of the Baal Shem Tov's look, of his hadrasponim, of the presence and of his face. And he sensed immediately that we're dealing here with a righteous person. And he couldn't throw the stones. So he immediately went aside and threw the stones that were designated for this mitzvah in his mind on the floor. The Baal Shem Tov noticed this, and as the fellow was walking away, the Baal Shem Tov walked over to the stones, picked them up, and kissed them. He kissed the stones. So this zealot, or we could call him by now former zealot, turns to Baal Shem Tov and he asks him, "Why were you kissing these stones?" The Baal Shem Tov said, "I sensed in these stones great sanctity, because your determination to use them, to throw them at me, was completely for the sake of heaven. In your mind, you were doing a tremendous mitzvah to defend Jewish tradition against innovators. You were doing a great mitzvah. These stones were designated as those items that are dvarim shebikdusha, items that are designated for holiness. So even though even though the intention was good, and even though the results, or even though facts are, I didn't deserve those stones thrown at me, but since you had good intention as you picked them up and as you designated them, they have holiness, and therefore I kissed them." This is the story that I heard about the Baal Shem Tov. And again, the similarity is that sometimes great people have the ability to push themselves away from the picture and look at the actions of others based on their understanding, right? And it's so healthy when we have social interactions to see the world not just from the way you see it, even if it's the truth, but the way the other person sees it. And Yosef is turning to his brothers and he says to them, "Listen, your intentions were good. Atem chshavtem alai ra'a. You thought that I'm the troublemaker. You thought that I'm the one that has a negative agenda. So your decisions based on the way you were thinking were good." So too with the Baal Shem Tov, he turns to this person, to the former zealot, and says, "In your mind, you were doing a holy thing. So therefore there's some value to it." That's what Yosef perhaps teaches us in this section. But there's one other detail before we move on to other things I would like to discuss today. You know, imagine the following scenario. Imagine the following scenario. You work somewhere, and there's a specific person in the workplace that creates a toxic environment. He's not nice to you. He causes you stress. He agitates you. And it reaches a point that you simply can't continue working there. And it was an okay job. It paid the bills. You felt okay with it. But it reached a point that due to the fact that this person was driving you nuts, you had to walk away from the position. A few weeks later, due to the fact that you walked away, you're looking for another job. And a few weeks later, another company hires you. And in the new company, you realize that your abilities and your toolbox are such that you're making a much greater contribution. You feel more satisfied. Your salary goes up and your success takes off. Okay? 3 years later, you meet at a gathering the fellow from the original company who caused you all the tsaros. How do you interact with them? How do you interact with that person, right? Do you look at them and say, you're a chayara? In other words, now that you don't have to deal with them anymore, you can express your feelings and say, you're an animal, the way you treated me. You have no decency. I can't forgive you for the way you treated me. Or do you step back and realize, wait a second. As a result of this person driving me nuts, I moved on to a much better place. So that indicates that was all part of a master plan. In other words, this individual was in some ways a tool of the higher being to do good for me. So I'm not going to have negative feelings towards them. I'm above that. You look at the world differently when you have such an experience, because you suddenly notice and realize that, things that take place, even if they are the byproduct of humans making bad decisions and not doing what they should be doing, it is all part of a big picture. There's a higher being running the world. And again, that is something that we must take from Yosef, to look at the big picture. That even when we have such occurrences, and I think we all do on some level, that someone causes us discomfort, and 10 years later, and we still have bad feelings. And sometimes we have to remind ourselves of the story of Yosef, and Yosef is teaching us there's a God. Perhaps atem chshavtem alai ra'ah, but the truth is Elokim chashva letova. There's a higher being running the show. And sometimes we have to look at people as pawns of the game of the Almighty. That's how we have to look at people. And obviously, it's easier to be forgiving like that. It's much, much easier to be forgiving if I recognize that even a decision of another person, and people do have free will, and there's no question it's not the right thing to do, but even such situations are part of the master plan of the creators. Those are some thoughts that I would like to share, but as mentioned, I need to work backwards in this week's Parsha. So we're going to turn now to the Levaya of Yaakov Avinu, a very significant Levaya that's taking place. And the Torah describes one specific detail of a eulogy that takes place at a specific location that needs some level of clarification. The Torah tells us in chapter 50, verse 9, that many Egyptians joined the procession. Okay, so this is what the Torah tells us. And then, chariots, horsemen, a very large camp joins the family to bring Yaakov Avinu from Egypt back to the land of Israel. And then the Torah tells us in verse 10, Vayavo, and they arrive, ad Goren Ha'atad. They arrive at a place called Goren Ha'atad, Asher Be'ever HaYarden, that is on the other side of the Jordan River. Now, it's very possible that means in Israel itself proper, but this is Moshe Rabbeinu telling the story to the people of Israel in the wilderness, so therefore he calls Israel proper Ever HaYarden. And what takes place at this location by the name of Goren Atad, there's a hesped, misped gadol, a great eulogy. And then we are told in verse 11, Vayar Yoshev haaretz haknani, the locals saw, et ha'evel begoren atad, they see the great mourning that is taking place at Goren Atad. Vayomru, and they said, this must be an evel for Mitzrayim, and actually they named the place after it. What I'm going to ask, and what we're going to focus on briefly, what is the meaning of Goren and Atad? Goren Atad. So number one, a Goren is a threshing floor. Okay, it's a circular surface. You could have your oxen making rotations, and you're going to go ahead and thresh your grain. So that's a Goren. What exactly is a Atad? What is an Atad? Atad is a type of thorn. So you have here a location that is called the Goren with the Atad. Goren of Atad, perhaps. Now, if the Torah tells us that a eulogy specifically took place there, there must be a message in these words. So when you study Rashi, he shares with you a rabbinic tradition that the Atad that is referred to here is not a thorn, but rather it's like a crown. And in the words of the rabbis, when the local kings noticed that on the deathbed, on the casket of Yaakov, was the kitro shel Yosef, when they saw the crown of Yosef placed on Arono shel Yaakov, on the casket of Yaakov, they decided to also place their crowns, and they surrounded the Goren, they surrounded the threshing floor with these crowns. So therefore the Atadim, the thorns that are described here, are not traditional thorns, but like crowns, and it does look like thorns sticking out of the crown. Now, what exactly does that symbolize? So first of all, what we're going to be analyzing now is the fact this journey of Yaakov returning to the land of Israel symbolizes the Jew returning to the land of Israel. Now, it doesn't just symbolize the Jew returning to the land of Israel from Egypt that is going to take place, 2 centuries later, but it actually symbolizes the Jew always returning to Israel, and the return to Israel in the Messianic era. So one of the commentators in the Netziv notes that you should know, in our tradition, what we are told is that when we are going to return to Eretz Israel, it is going to be done with humanity looking up, being inspired by us, and also giving us honor for what we are doing. And therefore, the idea that the rabbis had a tradition that that this thorn refers to a crown, and it is crowns that are given to the people of Israel because they are inspired by the crown of Yosef, symbolizes the honor that the human race and nations of the world are going to give the people of Israel in the Messianic era when they return. Okay? But we can add a little bit more to it. Some great thinkers of the 20th century saw secular Zionism as a messianic movement, and they even labeled it a movement of Mashiach ben Yosef. In other words, oral tradition always had an idea that before the arrival of the Messiah, there is going to be some kind of messianic movement that it's not going to clinch it, right? It's not going to finalize it, but it will assist in the process. So some great thinkers saw secular Zionism as that movement of Mashiach ben Yosef. I heard this a little bit from my father. It's mentioned obviously in the works of Pareshat Vayechi. People heard it also in the name of Rav Kook. This is a concept that exists. And the reason there's a comparison between the secular movement and Yosef is that Yosef externally looked like an Egyptian, but deep down he was a tzaddik. So too, this movement, yes, unfortunately, externally, right? The early Zionists were very far from the traditional Torah way of life, but deep down in its core had that holiness, because Jews making their way to Eretz Yisrael is a holy thing. So in its core, it has something holy. And if we are being told in this rabbinic text that humanity was inspired to honor Jews as they returned to Israel by giving their crowns, when they saw the crown of Yosef, it is very possible that it is referring to this idea that humanity will be inspired by the Yosef of the Messianic era. And perhaps, in other words, when CNN would talk about the fact that when there would be a natural disaster in some location in the world, that the first ones who are able to set up a field hospital are the Israelis. There's something inspiring there. When Bezrat Hashem, right, Israel has confidence, Israel's already rolling with these vaccines, while we in Canada, with all due respect, are not, it's not even a discussion of how and when and what the logistics are going to be. We look to the state of Israel and say, wow, they're doing something incredible. Now, obviously, as Torah Jews, we don't look at Israel just as a light in technology or in medicine or even in humanitarian aid. We look to Israel as a source of values of Torah, but perhaps we're getting a little bit of a flavor of this idea of the crown of Yosef inspiring humanity. Perhaps, but there's one other detail I would want to add. Threshing floors were extremely important in all cultures and societies, because you would not have food without a threshing floor. In our tradition, the study of Torah is compared to bread, because just as to bring forth bread, there's a process. And that process includes separating those things that are not needed, breaking down the grain, adding water and waiting and having patience. So too, when it comes to the study of Torah, all those requirements are integral to have the values of Torah. So threshing floors are important. Threshing floors have always been compared to Torah. And for example, the Sanhedrin on the Temple Mount, we are told they would sit, and the layout of their seats was such that it was kachatzi goren, like half of a threshing floor. So the idea of relating Torah to the threshing floor is something we find quite often. Now, it appears that the threshing floors in the past would place thorns surrounding the perimeter, because if, let's say, you are threshing grain and suddenly there's this intense wind that comes, what's going to happen. Bye-bye grain. So therefore, the norm was that they would have thorns surrounding the threshing floor. And most probably, the most basic shot of reading the words Goren Ha'atad, it means that there was a threshing floor that had around it atadim, which is a type of thorn. Now, we, the Jewish people, have a desire to be an inspiration to humanity. No question about it. But at the same time, we have the responsibility of establishing boundaries. In other words, I cannot become a very close friend to my Persian neighbor. Why? We connect through food, right? That's how humans connect. Reality is that my Persian neighbor is not going to be cooking for me a kosher meal in his house. It's a reality, it's a fact. And there are things that separate us from our neighbors. There are those boundaries. And yes, sometimes those boundaries create thorns. Everyone can tell me a story in the workplace that they were invited to an Xmas party and they had to walk around with their little glass of water as everyone else was enjoying the champagne and the tray for food. right? And they had to explain why they don't eat lobster, right? These are not comfortable moments. There are thorns that separate our threshing floor to the world around us. But in the Messianic era, as we return to Eretz Yisrael, and remember, the journey of Yaakov is the journey of return. As we return to Eretz Yisrael, the day will come that humanity will actually respect us for the boundaries we kept. There's going to be a time that they're going to say, you know what, those thorns were good things, and you deserve a crown for it. So therefore, the midrashic reading into it is not disconnected from the pshat, but rather it really tells us that the pshat will develop into it. One day, the thorns that separate us will be something that brings forth respect. I remember sharing the story in the past that my late father has a close friend here in Toronto, Dov Friedberg, and he shared with me the following story. It goes back probably 30 years, that they had some investors that were coming in from New Zealand, and they had to meet them for a dinner in their office. But the challenge was that they had to make, these fellows at the Friedberg's office were, do they wear their kippah for dinner or not? And the question was, their concern was the following. Here they are, kippah is not a requirement halachically, but when they eat, they try to wear it. But their concern was that these New Zealanders who arrive, who never saw a Jew in their life, if the people they're going to be investing millions of dollars with are wearing funny flying saucers on their head, perhaps it will be a turnoff. So they didn't know what to do. So they made a decision that there were four of them, four from individuals together, that two of them will wear a kippah and two will not. That was the decision. In other words, that if for whatever reason they're uncomfortable, at least they'll turn to the two normal people that are not wearing a kippah. So they did a gyro. They went ahead and they did a lottery, and that was the decision as who's going to yes wear a kippah and who not. Fine, they have the dinner. It's extremely successful. At the end of the dinner, the New Zealanders turned to the two individuals who were wearing a kippah, and they said the following: you should know, we have a tremendous amount of respect for your faith, for your religion, and to see Jews in the 20th century covering their head gives us pride and trust. And they were giving a whole mishaberach to the two that were wearing a kippah. And the two who weren't were little by little sinking into their chair, not knowing where to hide themselves, that they unfortunately were not getting any kavod, but rather in some ways rebuked for not wearing their kippah. That's the story. The story is that when we stick to our boundaries, when we have those things that, yes, at times are thorns, the day will come, they're going to turn into crowns. We will be respected. Obviously, we have to be consistent, right? If our religion is more like a joke, that I'm very, very frum in some areas, but then I act like an animal in other areas, right? I'm very sensitive to God, but I'm not sensitive to my fellow human. That's not the real religion. That's not the thing. But if you stick to it the way you should, the respect indeed will come. That's what we are told. Now, the last thing I would like to discuss is, and that's going to be our discussion now, relates to the word shvu'ah, an oath. A lot of oaths mentioned in this parsha, right? Keep your eyes open. The parsha starts off with Yaakov Avinu turning to Yosef. And he says to him, get me out of Egypt. Get me out of Egypt. And he shavali, vaishavalo. And then when it's time for Yosef to communicate with Pharaoh towards the end of the parsha that they need to get their dad back to the land of Israel. So you know how he informs him. Avi hishbi'ani le'emor. My father made me swear that after his passing, I will take him back to the land of Israel. And Pharaoh responds, Aleu kfor et avicha, go ahead, bury your father as you promised or as you swore to him. So the oath plays a very significant role here, the oath. What's it all about? What does it symbolize? So what I'm going to share with you, a few weeks ago, I don't remember how long ago, was my father's yahrzeit. I think a week ago was my father's yahrzeit. And in honor of my father's yahrzeit, my younger brother sponsored and participated with the Torah Mitzion Kollel here, the YU, Zichron Dov, the Kollel with the long name and with the lots of successes. He gave them what was known, he provided for them some Torah of my father, and it was labeled as an unpublished manuscript. Again, perhaps some of you saw it, the YU Kolo sent it out. It was an unpublished manuscript. Now, I thought that was very cool. It sounds very, especially in the academic world, when you talk about something that's an unpublished manuscript, it sounds very, very cool. And I got a little bit jealous, and I want to also do something from an unpublished manuscript. That was my deep desire. So therefore, I am going to share with you an insight now from my late father that comes from an unpublished manuscript. Now, what's cooler on my end, because obviously you have to upend your siblings in life, is that my brother got the unpublished manuscript from a copy. I have the original right here. So it's like really, really uplifting here. But let me share with you this insight from an unpublished manuscript of what my father read into this parsha. You know, in Shir HaShirim, the incredible Megillah that we read on Pesach, it talks about the journey of the people of Israel, our relationship to God, a little bit shaky at times, but there's deep love between ourselves and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In it, there are many, many references to our journey in Galut. Just as there's a lover there who has to keep away from the loved one, but eventually they reconnect. So too, that's the Jewish journey. And in Shir HaShirim, right, the word Shvuah appears several times. Hishbati etchem b'not Yerushalayim im teoreru et ahavat shetechpatz. In other words, don't awaken the love before its designated time, right? And as you know, the rabbis had many, many traditions as to how you read Shir HaShirim. And there's a statement in the Talmud, which many of you are familiar with, that takes the oaths of Shir HaShirim and shares with us the following tradition, that you should know. There are 3 oaths that relate to the journey of the people of Israel in exile. 3 oaths you have to know about. Oath number 1, in other words, these are not oaths that we took as individuals, but as a whole, as a nation, something we committed in exile. 2 of them relate to us. 1 of them relates to the nations of the world towards us, but they are known as the 3 oaths. Oath number 1 that the Talmud shares with us, based on the verses in Shir HaShirim, that Klal Yisrael committed, that throughout the years in exile, until we merit the messianic return, Shelo Ya'alu Yisrael B'choma. In other words, the land of Israel, for the many, many centuries that we were away, was like a wall to us. We couldn't go home. The tradition is that we took an oath not to make our way into the land of Israel by climbing a wall. Now, what does it mean by climbing a wall? When you want to get into a city, you could get in by being granted permission by officials, and you could walk through the gates. But there are times that you are not granted that permission, and your only option is to climb up the wall. Klal Yisrael committed to not make their way into Eretz Yisrael by climbing up the wall. That's oath number 1. Oath number 2, according to the Talmudic reading of Shir HaShirim, and again, it's an old tradition, that the people of Israel committed that throughout the years in the exile, Shelo Yimredu Be'umot HaOlam. We're not going to be mored. We're not going to rebel against the nations of the world. We're not going to be rebels. That's number 2. Oath number 3 is one that is not directed towards us, but it is directed to the nations of the world. Shelo yishtabdu ben beIsrael yoter midai. That yes, due to the fact that we are hosted by foreign nations, they have the right to collect taxes, but they shouldn't mistreat us too much. That's oath number 3. These are the 3 oaths in the Talmud. Now, there is a tremendous amount of literature on these oaths. A lot of it is to clarify it, because, for example, how can there be an oath that we don't make our way to Eretz Yisrael by climbing the wall? How can there be an oath to prevent us from returning home when there's a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael? It makes no sense. So one of the great commentators, early 16th or 16th century, Rabbi Shmuel Lidels, the Maharsha, he says that you have to understand clearly, as an individual, you can make your way to Eretz Yisrael at any time. But what we are being told is that as a group, as a nation, as a movement, we should not make our way to Eretz Yisrael until we are either granted permission or the Messianic era. Okay? You cannot make your way to the land of Israel without being granted permission. That is the first oath that we took as a nation. Throughout the years of the exile, we're going to remain here. We're not going to go up and climb the wall. And that's the symbolism of climbing a wall, making your way into the land without official permission. Now, by the way, these 3 oaths, while for many of us, they are Talmudic statements that perhaps we don't fully understand and don't emphasize too much on them, for some of our fellow Jews, they are fundamental. For example, if any of you are Satmar Hasidim, right, and disciples of Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum of Satmar, for them this is so fundamental that they rejected the Zionist movement based on it. They simply rejected the Zionist movement based on the 3 oaths. Okay, so believe me, interview any Satmar kid by age 3 or 4, right? They probably already know this section of Talmud, because for them it is fundamental. You cannot have a secular Zionist movement. You are violating one of the oaths in the Talmud. Now, obviously, we could respond in a very clear way, because the oaths are that we shouldn't rebel or we shouldn't make our way into the land of Israel without permission. When there's a body that represents the nations of the world, and that body granted us permission, the oath is no longer a problem. And this is a statement that is shared by Rab Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, the Or Sameach, a great rabbinic figure and thinker. And when we merited the Balfour Declaration, and we merited the conferences in San Remo, where the nations of the world declared, right, the League of Nations said that, you know what, the land of Israel, the Jewish people do have a right for a presence and a state in Eretz Yisrael, he declared, as a result, we have nothing to worry about the oaths. Okay, and even within the yeshiva movement, by the way, you know, the yeshiva movement, we've in the past talked about it, how there are different schools. There are some that are more influenced with the Satmar way of thinking and are less supportive of Zionism up until this day. And there are those that understand that this is a movement that's a gift from God after the Shoah. And don't be concerned from a statement in the Talmud, because after all, we were granted permission. We were granted in 1918, we were granted in 1920, and again in 1947, November with the partition. So these were different movements. Just on side, you know, I went to yeshiva in Chicago, and we had 2 heads of the yeshiva, 2 very special, righteous, great Torah scholars. And later on, at the time I did not appreciate it, but later on I understood that each one of them came from a different position regarding the state of Israel. While one of them, Rabbi Keller Zatzal, was very close to the philosophy of Satmar, Rabbi Levin, on the other hand, Zatzal, was a believer that the fact is we've merited a Jewish state. This is something that's incredible. It's something that's good, something we should be grateful for. So these teachings and these oaths are important to be mindful of if you want to appreciate what's taking place on the different philosophies and outlooks of the 20th century. They are indeed very, very important. Now, my father, back to my father, Olav Shalom, my father notes that you have to realize the burial of Yaakov, the burial of Yaakov, the return of Yaakov to Eretz Yisrael, symbolically is a return to Eretz Yisrael, and it symbolizes the Messianic era as well. It symbolizes the Messianic era as well. And just as you envision this tremendous caravan taking Yaakov from Mitzrayim into Eretz Yisrael, that is the vision that you have to have regarding the Messianic era. Jews making their way slowly, but in the big picture, it's quite fast, right? Over the past 120 years, look at the numbers. Kenai Nahar moving to Israel. We're looking at them right now of those who are participants of this incredible movement. But it's the same movement. Yaakov returning to Eretz Yisrael and our return to Eretz Yisrael, the Messianic movement. And my father notes, just as there were oaths that our tradition teaches us that were given to the people of Israel and to the nations regarding our existence in Galut and regarding our return, so too the oaths that appear in Pareshat Vayechi that relate to the return of Yaakov to Eretz Yisrael, oaths play a significant role. That's what my father says. And he also notes, when we talked earlier about the Goren Ha'atad, we talked about the threshing floor with the thorns. And according to tradition, the nations of the world giving their crowns, that too is a symbol to the honor that the nations of the world are going to give to Israel when we have this messianic return. And again, I always feel we get sparks of it. We get little sparks of it, of the nations of the world, what we've been seeing over the past year, of Muslim country after Muslim country, reconnecting or establishing some kind of relationship with Israel with respect and enthusiasm. And it's a gift from above. It's a gift from above. These are the crowns of return. And just as when Yaakov Avinu is returned to the land of Israel, it was with honor and crowns. The return to the land of Israel of the Messianic era is going to be with crowns and honor. But now it's time to study the unpublished manuscript. But one more detail I want you to envision here. If Yaakov's return, if Yaakov, right, his Levi, his return to the land of Israel, symbolizes the return, the interesting detail here is the fact that Yaakov at the time returns, but he's being carried by others, right? He's being carried by others, meaning it's not the person himself walking. It is Yaakov Avinu, the symbol of Klal Yisrael. We are all Bnei Yaakov, Bnei Israel. The symbol of Israel is being carried by others. And here we go. So now I'll share with you, and we're going to even put it up here. This is the unpublished manuscript. I hope you could see it. You see it there? Yeah, do we get a nod? You don't see it? You see it now? Good. So, Alan, yeah. How's it go? A thumbs up? Give me a thumbs up, Alan, if you see it. Okay. So my father notes here the following. You should know. Be'inyan hagimel shvuot. In other words, my father here, and these are personal notes of my father that I assume were only there for his own personal use, without any intention of it being published. But the fact is that we could benefit, at least I could benefit from it. So my father analyzes the three oaths. And one of them was, the first one was, Shelo Ya'alu Bachoma. In other words, that the return to the land of Israel should not be without being granted permission. In other words, we need others to as if carry us back there. In other words, if I want to return, if I want to be part of this movement of return, I need to be granted permission from an external party. Someone else has to carry me. So my father notes that symbolically it represents Hainu Shenasuet Yaakov. Yaakov was carried Velo halach be'atzmo. In other words, my father sees symbolism in the fact that Yaakov did not make his way on his own, but rather was carried. And just as when you are carried, other parties are doing it for you, so too our return is going to be with other parties granting us that permission. Now, that was oath number one. But when we are told also that one of the oaths we took was a commitment not to rebel against the nations that host us, shelo yimredu, you know how you find that in this parsha in a form of an oath? She Yosef bikesh reshut mi paro. In other words, in this week's parsha, Yosef has a desire to go out and bury his father. He was extremely committed to it. He asked permission from a higher authority from Pharaoh. He did not rebel, but rather understood that in Egypt, you get permission from Pharaoh and you respect their authority. That is oath number two. Oath number three, my father notes, that what? That lo ya'anu hagoim et Israel, in other words, the third oath that relates to the nations of the world, not overburdening the people of Israel. Where do you find that? Meaning that the nations of the world understand the Jewish needs, don't overwhelm them, and are accommodating. Symbolism for that could be found. Shehiskim Paro, that Paro was agreeable to Yosef's request. So the three oaths in the parsha that relates to symbolically the return. And by the way, the symbolism of return was so great that according to tradition, Yaakov made a request that his children carry his body, the same layout as their travels throughout the wilderness. This is a parsha of return. And if it's a parsha of return in Maseh Avot Siman Lebanim and it symbolizes the future, it is very logical to find references to these oaths. And this is what my father does here. And he says, Dayek v'timtza kal. That's what these three letters stand for. Meaning, if you look through the parsha, you will realize indeed that there is reference here to the future return. So that was a little bit of what I found from my father's writing, and obviously a little bit of an insight of the parsha and an appreciation of when we look at Chumash Bereshis especially, we understand that it is establishing patterns for the future, Maseh Avot Siman Lebanim. So I think it's appropriate to end Pareshat Vayechi with an appreciation that we turn to Torah for guidance to self-improve, to appreciate the Almighty, recognize that there's a creator, but also realize that the journey of our nation is not random. It is a journey that is guided by the higher being. And we turn to this text to find a little bit of insight to appreciate what we are experiencing in it, and obviously to see the hand of God in it as well. Okay, so I thank you all for participating. Thank you for listening.